Hi. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. I hope you've had a great lunch. I hope you've met interesting people, had lively discussions, and that you've carried on tweeting, because it would be lovely to keep trending on hashtag EIF16. So a slight change of pace after lunch. For a start, I'm not going to moderate this one because I'll be honest, I might get a bit emotional and it's not a good look to have a breakdown on stage. So now it's time for our one-on-one, what type of Brexit, a principled or pragmatic solution? So this is going to be great between Roland Freudenstein, who's Policy Director at the Martens Centre, and Alex Stubb, who really needs no introduction, but is former Prime Minister of Finland. Sirs.
Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Well, you know, since we're talking about Brexit, I might as well quote Shakespeare. And since with Alexander Stubb I'm talking to an incurable optimist, I might as well start off on a gloomy note. Since I've been quoting Macbeth, I might as well have started it with a hint of a Scottish accent. So, Alexander Stubb, there's a famous story about you when Jacques Chirac in 2005 said, Finland has the worst food after Britain. You, married to a British woman, famously invited him for dinner to actually test Finnish and British cuisine and bring the wine. I mean, you were perfectionist enough to add that note. Has he ever then taken you up on your offer?
Thanks for asking. As a matter of fact, yeah, we did invite Chirac over to dinner. And I think the quote was linked to something that he had said, and it was captured by the microphones in conjunction to the bid for the Olympics. It was Paris against London, and he told Putin that, something about Finnish food. And what we did was to put up a menu of Finnish and British cuisine. So we put some Finnish flavors into fish and chips and the rest of it. And it was put together by one of the famous Finnish cooks. His name is Jyrki Sukula. He's a little bit like our Jamie Oliver. We sent the invitation to Mr. And Madame Chirac. And they never responded. They never responded. And I heard from some etiquette person that we had done some kind of a blunder in the invitation. That's why he didn't answer. So unfortunately, he hasn't been to our home to eat yet.
What a pity.
Yeah, might be a bit late now.
Anyway, so talking about British cuisine already, let's start, before we come to Brexit itself, let's start with the Brexit campaign, which was quite interesting because, I mean, as a continental European, we've gotten used to decades of what some of us would have felt as harassment by the Brits about the global economy and globalism and global Britain and so on. And suddenly in the Brexit campaign, you see this, how should I call it? Little England instead of global Britain. Parochial, building walls, drawbridge uppers, let's stay closed and not open up. And how did these two factors play along in the campaign in your view?
Well, I think you're very correct to point that out. I mean, one of the big problems is obviously that when the UK joined the EU in 1973, it was very much a reluctant bride, if you will. It never felt very comfortable with the whole idea of EU membership. And the argument at the time was we're joining a common market. And then obviously there was a new referendum, I think in 1975, about that actual decision. And then the UK continued to be the reluctant bride and always focusing on the economic side of things. And the British press, for the better part of the last 40 years, has basically been anti-European in various forms. And you could obviously see that in the referendum campaign and the debate as well. It was very much post-factual. There was very little fact touted around about the cost of Brexit, about the cost of non-membership, about what kind of laws and regulations the European Union is involved with. So in many ways, it was like many referendum campaigns, emotional and not necessarily fact-based. And that's what I could at least sense looking at it from the continental side.
Well, now, do you believe that the Brexit decision is reversible in any way?
Well, that's the 1,000 euro question, I guess.
That's
and
cheap.
the answer, yeah, it is cheap. The answer to that is that I think we basically have three options with Brexit. Number one is a soft Brexit, where the United Kingdom remains not a member of the European Union, but has access to many of the policies and freedoms that the European Union provides to date. Option number two is hard Brexit, where basically at the end of the day, based on the famous Article 50, only two things are decided. Number one, the date for exit, which most probably now looks like the 1st of April 2019. And number two, how much do you have to pay in terms of previous commitments for exiting the European Union. And here you see different kinds of prices touted around from 55 billion to 60 billion. And then you basically decide on nothing else and start thinking about the future relationship later on. The third option, which is probably the worst one, is what I call a cliff edge option. And that would basically mean that the UK jumps off the cliff on the 1st of April 2019 without any kind of an agreement with the European Union of what Brexit means. That would be the nastiest ones. To answer your question directly, I think as a continental European, pro-European and also pro-British, we have to live with the reality that Brexit will take place. I'm not going to give you a percentage on that, but that is the premise that we have to work at if we're serious. The only people, point number two, who can prevent Brexit are the ones who created it, and that is the British public. Now that would then entail probably domestic political chaos, bad economic situation, a complete revamp of the political system and party political landscape in the UK. And that is not something that basically is something we can do. So at the end of the day, if the Brits so decide, they can have a new vote on a new deal, but it's not our decision, it's the decision of the British government and the British Parliament.
Right. Well, I'm sure that some people in the audience in the Q&A part will take you up on this, take us up on this. I can't help agreeing with that. So let's get to the soft, the hard, and the cliff edge options. Which one is the most probable in your view?
Probably the hard. So it's a bit, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So I would argue that for Europe and for the United Kingdom, a soft Brexit would be the best. The only problem from a European perspective on that is that that will obviously set a precedent for perhaps other member states to think that, well, as a matter of fact, is it more beneficial for me to have a bit of an a la carte internal market because the Brits got a soft Brexit. And so far from what I've seen is, as a matter of fact, that's not going to happen. The European Union is amazingly united on this. We look at the statement from the 29th of June, we look at the EU 27 approach. No one wants a pick and choose Europe, an a la carte Europe, where you can have your cake and eat it too. So I think a soft Brexit, as much as I would personally like it, is highly unlikely. The second option is a hard Brexit, and I believe that is what will actually happen. So we will have tough negotiations on Article 50, and those negotiations, as we know, as announced by Prime Minister May, and as actually verified yesterday by Westminster and the British Parliament, they will start on the 31st of March 2017. Those negotiations will obviously be difficult. They will involve money, they will involve jurisdiction, they will involve surveillance, they will have a lot of different issues in it. And they will last about a year and a half because we'll need 6 months for ratification. So they'll probably end sometime around October 2018, and then ratification and juris linguists and the rest of it by the 1st of April 2019. So I think that's the most probable outcome. The final outcome is a cliff edge, and that would spell disaster, I think, especially for the United Kingdom. Now, the interesting thing is, and I have traveled a lot on Brexit. I've been to London twice, now to Brussels. I've been to Berlin, Frankfurt, and Warsaw. I did not understand until I came to Brussels that how weak the British negotiation cards actually are. There's not that much that they can negotiate about. And that's going to be, I think, quite complicated and difficult for the UK at the end of the day. I would argue that the negotiating edge is with the EU institutions and EU 27.
All right, let me play devil's advocate here and kind of defend the strength of the British approach and saying Britain can have the cake and eat it. You know, the famous line that Boris Johnson actually mentioned a couple of times before the referendum, and then we saw it on the handwritten notes of Mark Field's assistant 2 weeks ago. Anyway, as far as I understand it, this is based on the assumption that 4 or 5 years down the line, there will be no more freedom of movement in the European Union, on the continent, because the cards are stacked against it. So in that case, access to the single market is quite a possibility because it's mutually beneficial. So that this whole trade-off between freedom of movement and, well, the four fundamental freedoms and full access to the single market collapses like a house of cards. Is that so impossible?
Nothing, obviously, in this world is impossible, but I think it's highly unlikely, because we should all understand that the recipe of the success of European integration for the past 60 years has been basically the internal market, and the foundation of that has been the free movement of goods, services, labor and money. That is what has created the welfare states of Europe. That was, at the end of the day, which made the European Union into an economic superpower, which built the market economy model, which at the end of the day destroyed the socialist and communist models created by the Soviet Union. So to self-destruct by starting to limit the free movement of labor, services, goods and money at a day and age when my 15 and 12-year-old children can basically order anything like they like on the net if they get their hands on my or my wife's credit card, which we don't allow, where you know, they are going to live in a world where their children are not going to ever go to school in a vehicle which has a driver. They're going to be printing their sneakers on 3D printers. They are going to be diagnosed better by artificial intelligence than by a doctor. To then suddenly build these walls would be absolutely absurd in a world which has the technological possibility to bring down those walls. So my argument is, as much as I like British cake and especially Christmas pudding, which we will be eating pretty soon, you can't have it and eat it too. This is one of the fundamentals, the core of what the European integration is all about. And this is where the big problem lies in the Brexit negotiations. If the UK was to accept two things. One is the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, which is fundamental for the internal market and for freedoms. Interpretations on, for instance, state aid and competition. And if it was to accept free movement of people, I think a deal, a way out could be found. But if and when the starting point of the British government, at least in the speech of the Prime Minister at their party conference just a few weeks back, is that no jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, no free movement of people, we want our sovereignty back, whatever sovereignty means in 2016, to be honest. You know, the starting position is very difficult. And that's why you cannot have your cake and eat it too.
All right. Now here's a spoiler question about the four freedoms. How free is the movement of services currently in the European Union, in the single market?
If it was up to me, it would be much freer. I was a very proud member and actually vice chairman of the Internal Market Committee in the European Parliament when we were pushing forward the Services Directive the last time around in 2004, 5, 6 and 7, And I think the European Parliament, unfortunately, not due to the EPP, of course, watered it down. And I would be much more open on that. But they are, I would argue, still free enough. The catch-22 for the UK in this situation is that they actually have less goods moving from Great Britain to the continent than services. So it is in their vested interest, whether it's financial services or others, to have free movement of services as far as you possibly can.
All right. But what I brought up that question because the British argument is very often that, well, if the free movement of services is not perfect, then why can't we take back control of migration? You know, we don't, I'm paraphrasing now, we don't want to exclude people, we don't want to rule out completely immigration, we just want to take back control. We want to be able to be in the driver's seat and determine who comes to our country. So what's so bad about this? And then about single market access, well, the argument runs, you know, we assure you, continental Europe, we don't want to ruin the European Union. It's not in our interest to destroy the EU. But please don't ruin us economically by, sealing yourselves off from British exports, be it goods or services. So it's in the mutual interest to have full access to the single market. And this thing about free movement of people, let's negotiate about it.
I mean, it's a good proposition, but let's take this one step back. I think we should look at Brexit in 3 phases. Phase number 1 is from the referendum to the 31st of March. Phase number 2 is the initiation of Article 50 on the 31st of March up until Brexit, 1st of April 2019. And phase number 3 is the new relationship that the United Kingdom establishes with the European Union. This is the sequence of events as they will unfold and happen. And then you come to the question of, what kind of a relationship will the UK have with the EU in the future? Because Article 50, and I'm not a lawyer, but I have read it, does not give any space or scope for renegotiating an agreement between a third party, i.e. the exiting country, and the European Union on, for instance, free movement. So there's no basis for that. That will have to take place when we renegotiate the relationship. Whether that relationship will then be an EEA agreement, which is highly unlikely, because why would Britain want to be like Norway, paying more for membership than Finland, but not having a seat around the table where decisions on the regulatory framework is made? Will that new relationship be a basic free trade agreement or a little bit more than a free trade agreement? That's when we can start discussing that part. And to make a final point on this, I think it's an irony of history that the United Kingdom was the only truly pro-European country in 2004. Why do I say that? Because it was the only country that did not put transitional arrangements for the free movement of people. Germany did not allow Central and Eastern European workers, nor did France. And there were many other countries that did it. Where did they all go? They went to the United Kingdom. What happened? Well, the United Kingdom benefited from that free movement of labor. And part of its economic success is based on that. But part of the reason that they left the European Union is exactly that decision. So this is the catch-22 that we have to deal with. And I come back to the argument that they are not going to be part of a single market unless they accept the idea of free movement of people.
All right, let me bring in the Trump factor and ask you, how could that maybe help the Brexiteers in Britain to look like they are the wave of the future? Because there is a possibility that Trump will offer Britain a bilateral trade deal long before anything like TTIP or post-TTIP will be agreed with the European Union. How does that factor play out?
Well, may I just ask a counter argument before I answer? Would you like to do a deal with Donald Trump?
He wrote The Art of the Deal. I mean,
So the question is, do you want to do a deal with your European brothers and sisters and cousins on the basis of international law and a set of predictable values and I would argue strong institutions, or do you want to do it on the basis of 140 characters?
yeah, of course.
So, the choice
Clear.
is yours.
All right.
But I think actually, to give you a more sophisticated answer, I would argue that Great Britain right now, the United Kingdom, is between a rock and a hard place. Because what we will most probably see is a weakened United Kingdom because it exits the European Union. And I would say that they're weakened politically, they're weakened from a security perspective, and they will be also weakened from an economic perspective. There's no question about it. I don't think you can get anyone who would argue that in the short or medium or even long term, Brexit is beneficial to the United Kingdom. It is not. On top of that, they have a United States which arguably is rather unpredictable at this particular moment, with a president-elect who we really don't know that much about, except that there are interesting policy initiatives almost every day. And if you look at free trade, if Trump, as his first day, with his first day in office, says no to TPP, if Trump says no to a Chinese acquisition in the United States, if Trump says no to a steel factory moving some of its production abroad, with this kind of unpredictability in his actions, would you like to have a free trade agreement?
Well, he says
and I
no
would probably argue no.
he says no because he didn't negotiate those deals. Okay, but you mentioned the United Kingdom. Well, how united is the kingdom going to be in the future, with Scotland allegedly determined to stay as close as possible and hopefully stay within the single market, even if England and the rest of the kingdom don't?
Well, that's one of the big questions, obviously, and something that has to be dealt with and decided internally in the United Kingdom. As we're all aware, they had a referendum on Scottish independence only a couple of years back, and a debate has emerged about a possible new referendum. Then obviously there's the issue of Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom as well. And when we look at the Brexit negotiations, borders is going to be one of the key negotiating parts on that. It was funny, Finland had its Independence Day, 99th Independence Day, 2 days ago on the 6th of December, and I put out a little tweet just saying that it's hard to imagine that 99 years ago Finland was a poor developing country, and now obviously with any measures you look at from international analysis, whether it's GDP per capita, happiness indexes, safety, transparency, non-corruption, and the rest of it, we're pretty much top 3. And do you know where I got most retweets from? Scotland. They were very happy about this independent notion of a country with a blue and white flag with approximately 5 million people, etc., etc. So you're going to see a lot of movement. So the S&P is certainly on the run.
And yet, more people have voted to remain in the UK, in Scotland, in the referendum about Scottish independence, than Scots have voted to remain in the European Union in the Brexit referendum.
Yeah.
And there is trade, which is overwhelmingly with the rest of the kingdom and not with the continent or anyone else. And there is a huge budget deficit in Scotland, which would come to bear quite dramatically in case of a Scottish exit from the kingdom. So I think I have the impression that the government in London is pretty calm about any perspective of pushback from Scotland, but I may be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it remains to be seen. I think in the UK in general, we all know that we're in for a rather turbulent period. I mean, when you've been a member of a club such as the European Union and all the layers that it brings into your societal relations, into your regulatory framework, into your economy, into your travels. I mean, when you start dissecting the whole acquis communautaire, you realize how far institutionally you're integrated into the system. And to try to dismantle that overnight, you know, it has ramifications and implications regionally or nationally, whether it's then in Scotland, Wales, or England, or Northern Ireland. So it's just going to be an extremely complicated and difficult thing. And this is the classic issue. You know, when you have a referendum like that, where the facets, the issues are so complicated, and the only answer is a yes and a no, you're not going to probably get it right, whether it's a yes or a no. I actually think, I mean, if we go back to the three options, hard or soft, hard, and cliff's edge, no matter what happens, there's going to be a lot of litigation. There's going to be a lot of time spent in court about obligations, about contracts, etc. So before this is all over, you know, we're looking at least a 10-year period. And that's why I'm saying that the third part is so important. You know, we've sort of survived the first part now up until March. The second part is pretty clean legally in terms of negotiating Article 50, but the third part then, whatever comes afterwards, what the relationship is, what the litigation is going to be extremely messy, and we don't know the consequences yet.
And there's a huge potential for mutual recrimination.
Yeah.
So the last question before we open it up to the floor. What should the EPP political family do in order to limit the damage and make it a constructive relationship as possible?
Well, I mean, again, I'm very subjective on this, obviously, and not only because I'm married to a Brit and I'm an Anglophile and the rest of it, but I remember my times in the EPP party, political group in the European Parliament, and that was actually the time when the British Conservatives were still a part of the EPP. I remember that time. I'm that old, kind of. I do not think that we should be rejecting the British moderates, and this is very important. I think any divorce procedure can turn extremely nasty, or then it can be cordial and civil. And I think the more careful we are with our language, especially to the outside world, the better off we are. Because if we start pushing the Brits away aggressively, which, you know, can happen, and we've seen that in some of the rhetoric. We can be tough and principled negotiators, as the heading of our discussion here is. But if we start pushing them rhetorically and basically saying no to everything and it's your fault and the rest of it, the knee-jerk reaction of the moderate Conservatives in the UK and even the moderate Labour Party people or Lib Dems will be to lift up their hands and say, okay, sod it. Have it your way then. We're going to be out of here. And the tougher we are with the language, the more certain we will be standing at the cliff's edge. And I would argue that the cliff's edge is no good for anyone. And so we have to be very, very careful. We have to understand what is going on in the UK and try to make this transition as painless as possible. It's not going to be easy, but I still believe we can do it.
All right, well, let's throw it open with this. We've got Thomas here. We've got you, sir, you. Okay, let's start with the three behind me. And please say briefly who you are and state your question or opinion. It may be a statement as well, if it's short.
Thanks, Prime Minister. I'm Thomas Miller from the Walt Disney Company, and I'm also the president of the British Chamber of Commerce. Two quick statements and one question. First, indeed, from a business perspective, for us it's very clear. We work on the assumption that the UK is going out, because already there is uncertainty. We cannot, wait too long before a decision is taken. That's one. Two, back to your point, Prime Minister, about Westminster and the situation there. It is also, we need to keep in mind that there is no credible opposition right now. So the government has a free hand.
Well, the court was a good opposition here.
The court was, but we'll see,
know
because the threat of a flash election is hanging out, and even for the Remainers, the risk of losing their seats in case of flash election is real. So that also plays into the discussion. My question is the following: do you believe in the possibility of sectoral agreement between the UK and the rest of the EU? Because I hear some of my colleagues from other industries raising that issue. Thank you.
Can you just say one word about what is a sectoral agreement? What do you mean?
Well, think financial services, like a special passporting agreement that could keep alive some of the single market prerogatives that this sector enjoys right now.
Excellent.
But that's only, I don't want to pick on them. That's one example.
We collect a few, all right?
Okay.
There was, sir. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Harry. I'm an independent investor, and as a person who lived also in UK, in US, and in Europe, I would like to ask about the humanity aspect of the things. There are many Europeans living in UK many years, and they would like to have some, let's say, security aspect of their lives. Is it any model to make sure that these people get, for example, visa, working visa, and why not UK and EU make a model like for UK, like for example, like Switzerland has, where a European can apply to a job in Switzerland, can go work there, and there is no problem. Thanks.
Okay, and we had you, sir.
My name is Anders Larsson. I'm a passionate entrepreneur. You said that the British people decided, but isn't it better to formulate that there was a manipulation of perception, because almost 50% decided to stay in? And the two drivers for a Brexit, Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson, left the ship the day after.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, madam, over there.
My name is Anna Vandensky. I'm from Brussels Diplomatic. So while enjoying the debate here, I see that now there are people queuing at Montepaschi Bank at Rue Montoyer to remove their money. My question is that you considered 3 scenarios, but why don't you consider the 4th scenario, that Italy would leave Eurozone? Is it probable, and how it will change the perspective of Brexit?
Thank you very much. And I think there was one last question up there. Yes, right, straight ahead. Gavin, right?
Next year, I'm Italian. My name is Andrea, and I'm a former EPP trainee. And my question is, next year there will be 2 very big, important elections, France and Germany. And in Germany, we just heard that Miss Merkel will run again for a 4th mandate. But as we saw a few months ago in the Länder, AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, and Die Linke and the Greens achieved a really good result. So in your view, how strong still is the impact of Brexit today, and how much it can affect these important elections next year? Thank you.
All right, thank you. We've got 5 points. We've got the question of the sectoral agreement. We've got the Swiss model. We've got what about the Remainers? What about the Italian scenario? And finally, how strong is Merkel in light of the Brexit debate?
Yeah, no, I think 5 very good and succinct questions. The first answer on sectoral agreements is that I think you will probably see a fairly united European Union and especially EU institutions, including the Council and the Commission, saying no to any form of sectoral agreements, at least during the span of the Article 50 negotiations. Now then the question bodes, what will be the future relationship, and on the basis of which sectoral agreements? That's when we start talking about those. But again, I come back to my earlier point. If they say no to ECJ jurisprudence, and if they say no to free movement of labor, then it's very difficult to start having sectoral agreements. What happens to competition policy? What happens to state aid? What happens to labor laws, etc.? And this will come back to the you can't have your cake and eat it too. I think we should think about a future relationship of the UK, phase 3, which I would call a Canada Plus. So it's a free trade agreement with then a few sectoral agreements on the way, which will probably include common foreign and security policy, defense policy, which will probably include counter-terrorism, justice and home affairs in one form or another. And we should see it as some kind of a transition. So we shouldn't sort of say no to all relations and then build them immediately. It should be a little bit more of a plateau. But to have sectoral negotiations at this stage, I would count that perspective, unfortunately, out. The question of citizens' rights, I think, is a very pertinent one and a very good one. And I should have mentioned that as one of the key issues. I mean, if you were to just define a few of the key issues that you have to look at in the negotiations. One is the date, in other words, when will it happen? Number 2 is the financial settlement, in other words, how much will it cost? Number 3 is what do you do to citizens' rights, and by that I mean in a broad sense. Brits who live in the EU, which from what I understand are more than foreigners or Europeans living in Great Britain. I have one at home. You know, my wife is British, so you know, she belongs to that category. And then you're going to have to look at enforcement and dispute settlement. So the issue of citizens is very important. But I think the British government right now is saying that, hey, calm down, we're not going to throw anyone out, you know, let's take it easy on this one. So the people who are working in Britain, nothing major is going to happen. And I think we should take their word for that. The third question was about, well, this was a referendum, how about the Remainers? That did the people decide? Well, there was a difference of 1 million votes, right? It was, if I recall correctly, 18 versus 17 or 17 versus 16 million. And the percentages were obviously pretty close, what, 51-49 or 52-48. But I think the political message that we hear all the time from the UK right now is that that was the referendum result, and we cannot reverse it. Where you're absolutely right, it's interesting to see actually that the first and biggest pro-European movement that we've seen in recent European history is right now in the UK. You know, 4.5 million people wanted to, you know, put out a petition to reconsider. And this is going to be a tough one to deal with. And that's why, again, I come back to the earlier question, you know, if we want to win the souls and the minds of reasonable pragmatic Brits who still want to find a solution to be as close to Europe as possible, let's not push them away. So let's not push the Remainers away, and that's why the language that we use, I think, is very important. The fourth question was on Italy leaving the Eurozone. I was in Berlin last week, and that reminded me I had a very nice tete-a-tete meeting with, where's the lady with the question? There, yeah, you were sort of behind, with Wolfgang Schäuble. And if you remember, on the 1st of September 1994, Schäuble and Lamas published a paper, which subsequently I ended up writing my master's thesis on, and then to a certain extent my PhD as well. It was a proposal of a core Europe, and that core would be created around the first 5 countries that would create the Eurozone. And the first 5 countries were the founding states, minus Italy. So this debate is not new, what I'm trying to say is, but I think it would be very unrealistic to think that Italy would be pushed out of the Eurozone. Now, obviously, you never know what kind of a domino effect comes from a referendum on a constitution like this, but I would argue that in comparison to the financial crisis and the way in which we dealt with it, 2008, 2009 and onwards, you know, this is not a minor event. I'm not putting it down, but it's not going to be a game changer, and no one will want to push Italy out. Having said that, if you compare France and Italy, France has come back to pre-2008 GDP per capita levels, whereas Italy is still far behind. But I hope that things can be, you know, calmed down on that front. And then there was the final question. You actually only mentioned 2 important elections and alluded to France and Germany. Remember the Netherlands as well. And that one is coming in March, a little bit earlier. And that can, to a certain extent, set the tone. My big answer to this question is to say that, as a matter of fact, Brexit and Trump has probably tilted the debate into a slightly more pro-European, traditional, institutional mode in these countries. We saw that with the elections, I would argue, in Austria of the president. I don't think that had much to do with the referendum in Italy. We see that in a lot of opinion polls right now around Europe. And if you look at the timing of the announcement of Chancellor Merkel running again for the chancellery, it was impeccable, because it was at a time when many European leaders, including US President Obama, came to Berlin right after the Trump elections. And if you look at the language and the statement that Merkel put out after the elections in the US, it was brilliant. I think it's one of the masterpieces that a lot of political scientists will be looking at. She basically said that on the basis of the values of democracy, market economy, globalization, human rights, fundamental rights, freedom of speech, I am willing to work with you, Donald Trump. And I mean, you know, in comparison to some of the other statements that we saw from European leaders, which were almost, you know, knee-jerk reactions that I'm not happy with the result, and therefore, that was absolutely brilliant.
Well, there were some very enthusiastic reactions.
Yeah,
too.
well, some enthusiastic as well. But you need to find a good balance, and I think Merkel did. And my argument is that Merkel is right now the leader of the free world. I think she's the one who has the courage to defend 3 things: liberal democracy, market economy, and globalization. And some people were hard on her case about her statement 2 years ago about wir schaffen das. We can do it. But look at what she said, and look at what has happened. Have a look at the migratory flows from September and October last year and compare them to the migratory flows today. I just heard from the Council that they're 2% of what they were last year. So in many ways, what Europe has done in the asylum crisis will probably not go down in history as the best result ever, but because of Brexit and Trump, no one is talking about the fact that actually we're doing quite well on that front. So we'll see what the AFP and other populists do. Then, of course, in France, we're going to have a rundown between, most probably, opinion polls tell us, as much as you can trust them today, between Fillon and Marine Le Pen. And right now, it looks like, Fillon has the trump card, if I no pun intended, and we'll see what happens there. But just a final point on that. Remember that in Europe, elections come and go. That's what democracy is all about. Governments are voted in, governments are voted out. And in that sense, yes, the elections in the Netherlands, France, and Germany are important, but at the same time, they're part of the democratic process. And if you have 28, soon 27 member states, there will be 4 or 5 elections every year.
All right. I mean, knowing Angela Merkel, I think she's terribly embarrassed about this leader of the free world stuff.
I know.
She wouldn't be Angela Merkel if she was jumping up and down with joy about this. No, but I think we don't have any more time for questions. Let me just finish up on this note. Alexander, you called British membership as the attitude of the reluctant bride. And indeed, one could have had that impression over the last couple of decades. But if we continue the marriage metaphor here, there are, in fact, unhappy married couples who get divorced. And after the divorce, they get along much better than ever before. So I think that's what we should be aiming for in these negotiations. And if we manage this, a kind of happy post-divorce relationship, I think then we've done a pretty good job in a messy situation indeed. All right, I thank you all for being here in such force. Thank you, Alexander Stubb, for sharing your insight with us. And in fact, to be honest, sharing an attitude which is hard to disagree with, because I totally agree to the moderate pessimism that you displayed.
Optimism.
Yes, we call it moderate optimism, moderate pessimism. You know, the glass is half full maybe, but we won't be able to redesign the glass to stay with that metaphor. Thank you very much, and we'll have a break.
Cashew.